and it hits me, oh my gosh, this is that triangle.
You know, there's explanation for everything that occurred in the Rendlesham Forest incident that doesn't involve aliens at all.
It was completely silent. It comes right over our heads.
He saw a classic flying saucer really standing in the clearing.
He turned over to my father and held his hand, and he looked in his eyes and he said, "We're not alone."
Welcome to Podcast UFO for our live show. We're live every Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on podcastufo.com. During the show, feel free to participate live in our chat room. And don't forget to like us on our very active Facebook page.
Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Martin Willis, your host. And our guest for this evening is Stanton Friedman. But before our guest, I have Randall Nickerson coming on. He's going to talk about the aerial phenomenon. And that's a film coming up. We're going to be talking all about that. Alejandro is taking the night off, so he'll be back next week. I want to tell you, I am actually heading out this evening for an entire month to Russia. Again, yes, again. But I'm going to do the show from Russia. It's actually in the middle of the night for me, from 3 o'clock to 5 o'clock in the morning. But that's all right. I'm dedicated to doing the show, so I'll be doing the show live from Russia. That's kind of interesting. Maybe I hope everything works okay. It should. I had an email come in, and I thought it was an interesting email. I do get a lot of email, and I don't mind. Anyone can email me at martin@podcastufo.com. So this one came in from a gentleman named Leon from North Carolina. Here we go. Martin, I really don't want to be negative because in this field, people tend to criticize. Everyone's fighting all the time. I don't want to fight with you, but I want you to know that your total disregard about the possibilities of connecting UFOs with anything else paranormal is so off base it shows and confirms that the fact that you have total ignorance on the lot of the UFO subject. Don't get me wrong, I praise you for starting your podcast, and I know you have a passion for the subject and all, but I would ask you to open your mind and don't stay in the box. A little one, I might add, to keep yourself in. I wish I had something better to say to you to do. Try hard, and you do try to be, you seem to be a nice guy, but you are totally clueless on the UFO subject. And you know what? I have to say thank you, Leon, for that. I am going to agree with you 100%. I feel like I am totally clueless. And thank you for that email. I have no problem with anyone, good or bad. I take them with the same grain of salt. So if you want to listen to the full shows, you can support the show. And our shows are always live. You can listen for free live on Podcast UFO every Wednesday at 8 to 10 Eastern Standard Time. You can also listen on the Dark Matter Digital Network, and that's every Thursday at 10 to midnight. All right, so we have Randy Nickerson coming on to talk about the aerial school phenomena. And unfortunately, we had audio capture trouble. So the first few minutes, we did not hear anything in this podcast with Randall Nickerson talking. I do apologize for that. Nothing I can do at this point. But we are going to be hearing him right now mid-sentence. You only missed a couple of seconds.
For an independent film, the average is about 7 or 8 years because you just don't have the financial means or the crew to get everything done. If you look at the credits on a film, there's hundreds of people involved, and right now we have 5, which is all volunteer. So that's where things are at right now.
All right. So you've been working on this film for the aerial school and a phenomenon that happened way back. John Mack interviewed people. You were going everywhere trying to reach these people who are now in their 20s. And I was able to meet Emily out in Phoenix. Mm-hmm. And she, having a face-to-face conversation with her, it was kind of spine-tingling, some of the things she told me, really amazing. Mm. And how difficult has it been for you to round up these people after all these years?
It's been fairly difficult. Not everybody wants to speak, and they're afraid of the ridicule factor, and getting in touch with them is one thing, but getting to them and interviewing them is a whole nother process. And but it's been great. I think I've interviewed quite a few people and that were directly involved, and have been struck by the sincerity and impact that it's had on them.
Wow. Now, have some people just refused, they're just not interested in talking about it anymore?
Wow, I've had some. Yeah, I've had a couple that just. It's more of a fear of their reputation in their public perception.
Mm-hmm.
I've had one particular person that felt that it was something to do with the devil that happened there, which actually spoke to me like, well, something. There was no question anyway. I knew something had happened there for sure, but. It was interesting. It's been interesting to see where people have taken it, in their own journey, whether they're dealing with it, not dealing with it, or, how they have interpreted it and played it out in their lives.
Do you think that had to do something with the influence of their family? Like they would get home and say, I had this major thing happen, and their family just saying, it must be the devil or something like that?
Yeah. I do think family and religion have played a big part in not all the kids, but a fair amount of them. Yeah.
Yeah. And how would you say, when you're talking to all these different people around the world, they scattered around the world basically?
They're all over the place. Yeah.
Yeah. And their story is. Would you consider like you said, they interpret it differently, but would you say there's a lot more consistencies than not?
Yeah, I think definitely the base story is consistent, and that's what's driven me to follow it. The basic facts of what occurred are similar across the board.
Yeah. Just to let the listener out there know, Randy's only going to be on for about 5 more minutes. So if anyone would like to call in and ask him a particular question about that, he was very, very involved with this way back. That's 603-967-4030 if anyone would like to call in. So
Great.
When you actually started this film, did you have like this project in mind, or did it kind of unfold as you moved along in the filming?
It kind of unfolded because I first got the John Mack interviews of the children, and then the question became, is the school still there? I just became really fascinated by those interviews and wanted to see if there was more, which has taken quite a long time to retrieve all the other media that had covered that event during that time. So yeah, step by step, and then when I saw more material, I decided, I want to contact these kids, find out where they are, and speak to them about what happened, and so that was a whole journey of getting the names to start, and then finding, trying to locate them. So yeah, it has it has been a journey and an evolving one. But now we just got back from Africa for the last time in November, and pretty much everything is shot. We've got all the archival that is needed, and just editing away and trying to raise funds for the finishing of the film.
All right, so we'll talk about that in a second. Now, when you're using old footage, is that something that actually you have to actually, I know this may be a question you may not want to answer, but do you actually have to pay for footage?
Yes.
You do?
Yeah.
And so is that a costly part of this project?
It is, yeah. Archival is the most costly part. It's a big chunk of change for sure to pay for the use of people's footage. Yeah.
But I understand that, how important that is in this particular film.
It is.
Yeah. And if you can just kind of give a kind of an encapsulation of how this works, are you feeding, I'm just guessing here, but you're feeding in some of the archival of when Dr. Mack was interviewing these children, and then kind of like the journey on toward today? Is that a kind of where it's going?
Well, it is a mixture. I mean, it's the story played out, in real time, back at that time, because there was enough footage and enough people shot, media organizations and individuals, that there's an enormous amount of material to actually tell the story in real time and then bounce to present day. So it's an unusual film. I just had an editor come in and say, "My God, I can't believe how much archival you have. That's incredible. To be even able to get that amount of archival on a single event is amazing." So I feel good about that. And but the story, it's going to be I just can't. It's really good. I'm not talking about myself. It's everybody involved, but it is a really powerful, moving story.
All right, and what people are going to want to know, I think mostly, is, and I know you're right in the middle of the editing process. We've had a couple conversations since then. And when do you think it will be released, and how will someone be able to see it?
Well, this year is the goal, and that really depends on funding, and things are moving along really pretty quickly. It's just I need more people on board, and that's where I'm running into difficulty. And I think it's probably likely going to enter the film festival circuit first, and then likely be on a network.
Good.
Yeah, and so that's the goal, and it's just it's the biggest part has been funding. It's unfortunate, but true.
Yeah, and I think I personally think this is, and I'll ask Stan later on what he thinks about this incident. Myself, I think it's one of the, the top, if I had to say the top 10 incidences. It's definitely within that, and maybe even close to the top of that. I think it's an important situation and an important film that you're doing. And how can someone be a part of this?
Well, we're running an Indiegogo campaign right now. People can go to Indiegogo and search Aerial Phenomena 2016. Ariel is ARIEL, and we also have a website, aerialphenomena.com. And yes, definitely looking for donations. We need to get another computer for a second editor, and so yes, it's I can't agree with you more as far as the story and the importance of it. It really needs to be told, and need as much support as possible.
Right.
And looking for private investors as well, for sure. And also we have a Facebook page that we have over 20,000 people on it, and that is Facebook Aerial School Documentary, if you want to chime in there. But definitely would appreciate any support, and it's definitely going to good cause and a group of really good people who are working with their hearts, and that's what this film is about. It's a really heart-driven film.
Just one more thing comes to mind. I can't imagine actually someone going through this at such a young age. Would you say that it profoundly affected a lot of their lives?
I think it. I think it depends on the person. Everybody deals with it differently, or has dealt with it differently. A lot of people have not thought about it, sort of blocked it out, and others have really gone into it and opened up to what it really means in their lives. So I think I think you find that with anybody that's had these experiences, that there's a wide range of what the human being decides to do with it after it happens, how they deal with it, how they process their feelings, emotions, thoughts around it, and how it affects their worldview.
Yeah, I can totally understand that. And I know I just said that was probably the last question, but I have one more.
Okay.
I was speaking with Emily, she mentioned, the thought almost, just appearing in her mind about, we better take better care of the earth. And was that kind of a common theme that a lot of people felt?
I would say it was a small percentage. It wasn't a large percentage of the witnesses. But it was impactful, whatever was communicated there. And I in research, I've found that's also pretty common of a message that is been given is, some like another species telling us, we've got to clean our cage, so to speak.
And I agree, we do.
I think we do.
Yeah. All right, Randy. So someone can go to Indiegogo and they can just look this up and help you out. And if anyone's looking to invest, it's probably going to be this is going to end up being a big deal. I know you're an amazing photographer, and your work is very carefully done, and you take real pride in your work, whatever you do. So this is going to be a major film, and it's going to be a great film.
Thanks.
And I'm really, really looking forward to it.
I think it will. I really, really have a lot of. And when I start talking about it, I get really excited because it's definitely going to have an impact for sure. And it's a story about people and this issue, human beings and what's out there.
Right. All right. So, Randy, thanks a lot. And I'm sure we'll be talking soon.
Yeah. All the best to you.
All right. Take care.
All right. Bye now.
Bye-bye. All right. So now, in just a second here, we got Stanton Friedman coming up. And a little bit about him. I'm sure if you're listening to the show, you already know who he is. He's a nuclear physicist lecturer, and he has been at this for a very long time. I think I remember him telling me about saving money and buying an extra book, and it was a UFO book, and that's how we get started. We can chat a little bit about that. But the one and only Stan Friedman, how are you?
Well, I'm fine here in beautiful downtown Fredericton, New Brunswick.
That's right. And I always forget, you're 1 hour, you start your day 1 hour before us here on the East Coast.
Well, of course, the sun rises from the east, so. Yeah, we're 4 hours ahead of California, which Californians have trouble with.
Yeah. And I imagine you probably have a lot of trouble because you're asked to go on a lot of late-night shows, so you have to keep some late hours yourself when you do that.
Well, it does happen, yes. Yeah, I try to get them earlier, but, But remember, I'm independent. I work for myself, so I don't have a boss to satisfy except me. And we do what we can when we can do it. And sometimes that's late, and what the heck. Yeah.
Now, Stan, we were in touch last week, and I want to tell. I told the audience last week on my podcast. My show wasn't live last week. We had trouble with the server went down, and we couldn't run our show live. So I want to tell the listening audience, if you can bear with me, I'll kind of give them the story and tell them why I contacted you. Okay, so it's kind of a little bit of a lengthy story. I'll try to make it kind of short. I help out a good friend of mine in the auction business. I've been in the antiques and fine arts forever, and help out a good friend. We've known each other since we were little kids. And back in 2011, he asked me to come to his auction house and help him out, pick up a real important collection of Chinese porcelains. And he said the guy was a Chinese diplomat. He was a CIA real important person. He was also a Japanese diplomat at one time and a flying tiger and had quite a career, and he passed away and to go pick up his things from his son. So I spent the day back in 2011 in this gentleman's house, beautiful house, and full of these beautiful porcelains that I was picking up. I was there for several hours and got to talking to him a little bit about his father. He said, yeah, my father was in the CIA, didn't talk much about it, so we really don't know too much and, all that. All right, so I packed everything up and we were going out the door, and I asked the people that were, loading the truck. Well, first of all, he said, take everything in the garage. And the only thing I saw interesting was a footlocker, and it was inscribed from when this gentleman was in the Flying Tigers, World War II. So they loaded it up. It went to the auction hall. So I was visiting the auction hall about 2 weeks ago, and they found this website, Podcast UFO. I don't know what they were doing in the office, but a girl came out and said, hey, you're into UFOs, and I saw one back in 1976. It was a triangle, this secretary in the office, a great story all on its own, she told me, and ended up being in the papers and everything at the time. So anyway, the owner, my friend, longtime friend, John, said, so you're into UFOs. I got something to show you. And he's walking around. He's trying to remember the name. He forgot all about that. I picked the items up. But it ended up being the footlocker that I picked up in the CIA's home back in 2011. And in the papers, he had just looked through real quickly one time, and he found the MJ-12 documents, the copy from probably from 1984, and that's what I'm going to ask Stan about. But old yellowed paper, and these copies come out, and I go, what the heck? Well, doing a little bit of research, this CIA retired. He was 64 years old in 1984, which brings up the question, why would he have those, if those documents were copies that came out in 1984 that you were involved in, Stan? It is curious why this ex-CIA at that time, unless he had a specific interest in UFOs, would have these documents. What did you think about that whole situation?
Well, okay, let's go back to how we got them. I had been working with Bill Moore on Roswell. And then I moved back here to Fredericton. He was living then in California. And I had put him together with Jamie Chandray, who was a television producer in L.A. And so they were working together, and Bill would keep me informed. And then he got contacted by some kind of an insider who intimated that he wanted to help him out, a guy with intelligence background. And so they had numerous contacts. And then one day, a roll of film shows up in Jamie's mailbox. And a 35 millimeter film. You guys remember back when people used to use film in cameras, And so Bill processed the film. A lot of people did their own stuff way back then. And on it were 8 pages of top secret material about Operation Majestic 12, specifically a briefing for President-elect Eisenhower, dated in November before he became president. And page 8 was a letter, a memorandum from President Truman to James Forrestal, who was had been Secretary of the Navy, then became the first Secretary of Defense, and so forth. Anyway, it was instructing Forrestal to handle, I'm not even thinking of the right word to use it, to establish this group called Operation Majestic 12 to report accountable only to the president. And it was dated on the only day there was somebody else mentioned, Vannevar Bush, who was an outstanding scientist and headed a lot of early research and development programs. And the question, of course, was whether these documents were genuine. The briefing document named the 8 people who were on this, the 12 people, MJ-12, who were on this Operation Majestic 12. But there was a problem. There were 6 military and 6 civilian, and most of the civilians were scientists. These were all outstanding people. But there was one guy listed as a member of this group who made no sense at all, and that was Dr. Donald Menzel, Harvard University professor of astronomy, who was a total debunker, wrote 3 anti-UFO books, and was constantly giving speeches and so forth, saying it's all malarkey. Now, how could he be part of a group that knew about crash saucers, Roswell, alien bodies, etc.? So we were very hesitant about going public until we didn't want anybody to be able to stand up and say, hey, gotcha, guys, I put that together. So we took our time looking at stuff, and I did run across, I was checking, let's get the facts straight before putting our mouths in gear kind of thing. And I was studying the papers of Dr. Bush at the Library of Congress Manuscript Division in Washington, and I found something in there listing under, there were a lot of stuff, and listed under Menzel, and there was a lawyerly letter, a letter from a prominent lawyer in Boston, thanking Bush for making sure that Donald Menzel didn't get deprived of his security clearance and wasn't declared unpatriotic. And so what the heck is Menzel doing with the security clearance, and why would he have a hearing? And I looked in Washington Post, New York Times, neither one of them mentioned these hearings. It would have been 1950. So I called the lawyer and found out, there's 1,000 pages about that hearing in the Menzel papers at Harvard. Oh, okay. So I contacted the Harvard Archives and found out that I had to get written permission from 3 different people to look at his papers. So it was not the kind of thing you could walk in off the street on. So I sent the letters and got the permissions and arranged the Fund for UFO Research, gave me a research grant. And I went up to Harvard. And looking at the titles, I knew most of his UFO stuff was at the American Philosophical Society Library in Philadelphia. It's still there. Some of it at the University of Denver, where he had done his undergraduate work. So where am I going to look? There was something with the file folder labeled JFK. And I hit pay dirt. I was very lucky. I found, to my total astonishment, I didn't like Menzel when he was alive. Because, any college freshman could have shown how wrong he was at his identification of cases. I mean, this is a prominent Harvard professor, and that, I wasn't impressed in the one contact I had with him. So I'm looking at these papers, and son of a gun, there are letters from Menzel to Jack Kennedy. Now, they knew each other very well, as it turns out. Kennedy had been on the board of overseers at Harvard, and his area of interest was astronomy, and he and Menzel got to know each other, and they often had breakfast together, walking from Jack's office to the university. Anyway, here's a letter, for example, one of the first ones that I saw, from Menzel to Kennedy, saying that there is one area, Kennedy had just been elected, and there is one area where I may be able to be of assistance to you. It's about the National Security Agency. I have a longer continuous connection with them of anybody in the country, about 30 years now, them and the Navy predecessors. When we are properly cleared to each other, I can tell you more. That's what he's telling the president.
Wow.
And then I'm reading more and finding more, and it turns out Menzel there was an unpublished autobiography, you can see why it wasn't published, in which he said that he did classified work for many companies, many agencies. And it turns out, not only with the NSA, but turns out he was a cryptologist. And there's an article published about 7 years ago. I mean, I'm talking about back in the 80s, but 7 years ago, somebody who got a look at that same unpublished autobiography did an article on Donald Menzel's contribution to cryptology. And there were lots of them. And it turns out that he even organized classes at 7 different women's colleges around Harvard in the early 40s. because they were looking for women to be cryptologists. They wouldn't get drafted, of course, which was an advantage. And he thought that they were better at it than men. And so here's an article patting him on the back for his major contributions, which nobody had known about. And when I published an article in the Center for UFO Studies as a journal, The Double Life of Donald Menzel, I had a number of people give me a hard time. Stan, he was a debunker. He couldn't have known anything about Roswell. This is all baloney. Somebody just put his name there and so forth. And none of these people in all these years, as far as I've been able to tell, ever went to Harvard to look at his papers. That's typical of the debunker attitude, you know. So the MJ-12 stuff, I published a book, Top Secret Magic, M-A-J-I-C. That was the security markings on this thing. I published several papers. I published a final report on Operation Majestic 12 on the basis of my research efforts. It was exciting. And what I found was this, that there are loads of MJ-12 documents out there, maybe 100. But almost all of them are fraudulent. And I showed that some of them were fraudulent. Let me give you an example. One of the documents says, it says that General Wiedemeyer was heavily involved in this stuff. And I called the Marshall Archives because I knew enough about Wiedemeyer that he had been a China expert. He had spent a year in China before for General Marshall, who was the chief of staff at the time. This is back in the time when, you know, what are we going to do about China? Mao Zedong and the whole business. It was complicated. We didn't know where we were going with that. So I checked on that, and I called the Marshall Library. I've been to 20 archives. I'd like to go to the first-hand data, you know. And I asked the archivist whom I had met, I said, can you think of any reason why General Wiedemeyer should be part of MJ-12? He was a China expert, wasn't he? Not a technologist. He said, no, I can't either. Well, why don't you check his book? I didn't know he'd written a book, I must say. The Wiedemeyer Reports. He said, oh, yeah, it was a bestseller back in 1957. So I got very lucky. I called the University of New Brunswick Library, which is less than 2 miles from my house, mind you. Mentioned the book, and they had it. I went over, took it out. I have borrowing privileges. I get a card every year. And started looking through it. There were 3 letters, I'll call them, documents would be better, I guess, that clearly had been used as models for somebody who made a few changes here and there and Xeroxed the handwritten part and had spread out as MJ-12 documents. I found 3 of them in this one book. And all you had to do was look at them and you realize this is the guy made a few changes and put this out. So I went back to the library later, and not that same day. I looked in the same department where I'd found Wiedemeyer's book and found another book and found a couple more of these phony documents. So I'm on the one hand, a total believer that there really was an Operation Majestic 12, and that there are at least 3 legitimate documents, the original 2, and then we got some letters or postcards suggesting we look at Washington, and Jamie and Bill went there and found another document, the Cutler Twining Memo.
Right.
Bobby Cutler was Ike's national security advisor, basically. General Twining was a member of MJ-12. He had been, he went on to be Chief of Staff of the Air Force. He'd been head of the Air Materiel Command at Wright Field, which is where Project Blue Book was. And he was certainly involved in the early days of Roswell. And so, this memo was it didn't say anything important. It's from Cutler telling Twining that a briefing will take place at a somewhat different time than had originally been planned. Change your plans accordingly, basically. But the subject line said MJ-12, Special Studies Briefing, something like that, MJ-12. Wow. And the question is whether the document was legitimate. And it doesn't have a signature on it. Well, I had other documents from Cutler. On some of them, it says original signed by, so this one wasn't signed, and it didn't have that. And Phil Klass challenged me on the document. It's a funny story. He sent me a kind of snide letter saying, probably you didn't notice that the Cutler Twining memo was done in the large pica type. But the NSC used only a leap type, and here are 9 documents to prove that. I challenge you to find any other genuine documents from the NSC done in the same size and style type. And I'm offering you $100 each up to a maximum of 10. And they've got to meet certain criteria. There were the signatures and dates and so forth and so on. Okay. So this was a crazy challenge. And I'll tell you why in a minute. But basically, I went to my files. I found 20 documents done in the same size, but not meeting all its criteria. But they were done in pica type, no question about it. I sent him copies. I was playing games with him, really. He accepted 2. But I was going to the Eisenhower Library, so I knew I'd have a chance to find more. And I went, and I found 14, copied them, sent him copies, and an invoice for $1,000, maximum of 10, he said. And he paid me. He told everybody about challenging me and nobody about paying me. And amazingly, in the class papers in Philadelphia, American Philosophical Society Library, there is no Stanton Friedman file. We corresponded for 20 years. There's 35 boxes of papers and letters and so forth, and it's as if we had no connection. I don't think he wanted anybody to know about it. But here's the really crazy thing is that he had never, I checked with the Eisenhower Library. I spent weeks there altogether. He had never been there before or after this. Now, it turns out they had about 250,000 pages of NSC materials. Now, how can any rational person generalize from 9 to 250,000? Well, these 9 are done in elite type. He got them by mail, incidentally. Well, then obviously all the rest are. That's nonsense. Totally ridiculous. And so that's typical of the objections that have been raised to the documents. Don't bother me with the facts. My mind's made up.
Right.
And there are a whole bunch of these silly things.
Yeah. I do want to ask you a couple more questions about this. But first of all, just to follow up for the listeners as far as this particular gentleman, why he had the copies, I am trying to find that out. Currently, the son is vacationing in the Caribbean. So when I actually get to talk to him again, I will ask him if his father, first of all, had an interest in UFOs. I mean, that would be an answer for why he would have those documents, especially if they came out in 1984. I did look into, someone asked if I should get them checked because they did indeed actually have copiers in 1953. They were very rare and only a few places had them. But I did contact a document specialist in Illinois. They said they could actually test and date the paper and test and date the ink with what was out there at the time. However,
you can't do that because we don't have the originals. We have a roll of film.
Right. No. I'm talking about this all had to do, Stan, when I saw the copies, and I know they're from the film, but I looked into it first to see if these copies that I ended up forwarding to you could possibly be from an earlier time, and they take a retainer of $2,500 before they test the paper, even page 1.
Well, yeah.
But since we talked after that, and I sent you the copies, you think they're actually copies of what you had from the roll of film?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay. If you look at them and look at what I've got, and it's been published. These are not rare birds. I mean, my book has Top Secret Magic, as I said, all 8 pages, not just the 4. You sent me 4. Were there more than 4?
No, there were 4. Yep.
Okay. Well, there's a total of 8, and that didn't include the Truman Forstall memo. But I published it in my final report on MJ-12. That was in 90, maybe. And it's in my Flying Saucers in Science. They're interesting reading, you know.
They are. And the thing... I also want to tell the listener out there, I did, because of the curiosity, why on earth would, this ex-CIA have these documents? That's still the puzzling, and I'll probably find a simple answer. But these were in his footlocker with 1953 and 1955, 1944, World War II when he was a Flying Tiger. All these papers, why would he put them in there is another question. Why would he put it in with all his other papers?
Good question.
It is a good question. And I did have someone from the West, out West, had a conspiracy. Well, maybe someone seeded him in there to, have someone find it and start another conspiracy. Who knows? It's all
I don't know.
Interesting questions that will be answered. So, Stan, the question I have for you, I think I've heard you say a number of times, you think there are possibly a couple of these that may be authentic, and do you think that the 3 primary,
the Cutler-Twining memo, the Truman-Forstall memo, and the Eisenhower briefing document, I think these are all genuine.
And why would you think someone would mix in all the other fakes?
Well, they didn't mix in all the other. They got distributed out in the world, but they weren't part of these documents. In other words, I think there's another fact I should put in here. The last surviving member of Operation Majestic 12, the original group, died in 1984. And it was and his obituary was in the New York Times. So if somebody was waiting for the last death, and then he sent us the roll of film. That's all I can say. Remember, the guy was breaking the law. It's against the law to photograph and distribute classified material. No question about that. So people say, why didn't he come forward? He's admitting he committed a felony. But I also found out that the Cutler-Twining memo, for example, that box had been handled, again, after the death of the last survivor. There's just a 3-month period in there. And so there are a whole bunch of details in these documents. That's why I wrote a whole book and several papers and so forth, because people have raised all sorts of objections, and I've tried to deal with every single one to see which way things go, the facts. Give me the facts, man. Who was it? Joe Friday said that? This is Stan Thursday or something.
I watched that. Dragnet, right?
Yeah.
So, they are interesting reading. So do you think that the others, though, that came out, someone really put a lot of energy into...
Well, you say someone. I think my best solution is that somebody at headquarters, Air Force Office of Special Investigation, said, what are we going to do about this? We can't make a big noise and say that they're genuine. You don't prosecute somebody for distributing classified material, because then you're admitting that it's legitimate. You're behind the 8 ball. So I think the simplest explanation is some class of students was asked, let's see if we can manufacture phony documents. And I talked to an ex-CIA man, Carl Flock, he's dead now. And I asked, there's a signature on the Truman Forstall memo. And it's pretty close match to one that was on a memo from Van Bush's office. And I was the one who found it because I was looking for that sort of stuff. And I wondered whether somebody, why is somebody doing this? But my best answer, I asked Carl if that signature could have been lifted by the CIA. He said, of course. And if you remember the story of capturing that Nazi and taking them back to Israel, the team that did that had with them a guy who was a documents guy because they needed exit visas and, all kinds of stuff. So they had to be good. So there's a big business in disinformation. And if you put out crap, and enough people say, well, this one's phony, that one's phony, they must all be phony. In other words, I don't think one guy was running around doing this. I think it was a major effort. Because, let's face it, if these documents are real, even just the three that I'm talking about, that I say are real, then that solves all the problems. Are aliens real? Yes. Are they visiting? Yes. Did Roswell happen as described in the document? Yes. Those are incredible new truths. The government obviously isn't about to release those. I mean, a lot of people don't know the NSA, for example, because of a lawsuit under Freedom of Information and so forth, they admitted to having documents, and they finally released some because there was a change in the official regulations and so forth. Finally, we got, many years later, we got 156 pages of top secret Umbra NSA UFO documents. Wow! The only problem was you can read one sentence per page. Everything else is whited out. Now, the CIA had released 800 pages up through secret, but no top secret material. But when finally I got some from them, and they're all blacked out. You can read 6 words on a page if you're lucky, kind of thing. These are all old documents, and I get people saying, "Oh, there's no classified information. They're not withholding anything." Well, fine. Get me clean copies of these 156 pages over here, those dozens of pages. And we have to remember what General Carol Bollinger said. He was an Air Force general who was working on a lunar excursion module in 1969. You may remember we landed on the moon, and as he told me when I talked to him, I don't know if anybody else had talked to him, and he's dead now. I can't guest on your show. He said, at least when we landed, at least I didn't have to work 12-hour days anymore. Anyway, he was asked, because the University of Colorado, the Condon Report, had recommended that Project Blue Book be closed. That was in early '69. And he was asked by the Air Force. He had no previous connection with UFOs, Blue Book, or anything like that. What should we do about Project Blue Book? Because the Condon had said, it wasn't doing anything for intelligence or technology or, why not just close it using valuable manpower? And I tend to agree with him that it wasn't doing something. Anyway, Bollinger put out a memo and at the end of '69, which wound up being responsible for the closure of Project Blue Book. We didn't get that memo. Bob Todd, a researcher who filed hundreds of Freedom of Information Act requests, got it with a pile of other stuff, probably inadvertent. Anyway, we saw a copy in 1979, 10 years later, and it was shocking. In it, Bollinger said, it's not a long memo, maybe 5 pages, something like that. He said, reports of UFOs which could affect national security are made in accordance with JNAP 146, or Air Force Manual 55-11, and are not part of the Blue Book system. That's an extraordinary statement. And 2 paragraphs later, he says, if we close Project Blue Book, the public won't have a government place to report sightings. However, as previously noted, reports which could affect national security will continue to be investigated using the procedures designed for that purpose. Now, what the heck does that mean? JNAP 146 or Air Force Manual 55-11, but where did those go? And I'm saying they went to Majestic 12. It's the obvious answer. And when I called Bollinger, I asked him, I said, look, it sounds to me like you're saying, told him that I'd had a clearance for 14 years and was very interested in UFOs and read his memo with great interest. I said, it sounds like you're saying that there are 2 separate communication channels. One for reports that could affect national security. As I told him, I had a report a few weeks ago of a saucer going down the runway at a Strategic Air Command base where nuclear weapons were stored. I would presume by definition that's national security. And then if my wife and I are driving down the street and see a UFO, big deal. It happens all the time. No reason not to report that. And he agreed with me. 2 separate communication channels. Now, what you have to think about is there should be one group, not 3, not Army, Navy, Air Force. And incidentally, one of the crazy things is the Office of Naval Intelligence says, we don't have anything about UFOs. Well, I've talked to loads of Navy guys who tell me about sightings and reports that went in. Where did they go? Well, my view is that there are 2 important areas where you need highly competent technical people with clearances. One is examination of crash saucer wreckage. Not just Roswell, but Aztec and the plains of San Agustin and a few others that have happened. You shouldn't have 3 groups. There should be 1 group. Secondly, we have means of monitoring the flights of UFOs, not just radar on the ground and radar in the sky, but aircraft chasing UFOs with their radar on and electromagnetic measuring gear, if you will. And you need somebody to analyze that stuff. In other words, how does the color change as the speed changes? And did it really make a right-angle turn? And, there's a whole bunch of stuff that you want to find out about. And so we've never seen that information. It's not just the old NSA stuff that's gone, but anything that could affect national security. And people say, well, what do you mean national security, Stan? I said, every country in the world would love to be able to duplicate the flying behavior. The ability to hover, to move extremely rapidly, to make right-angle turns all silently, to go up and down, backwards, forwards. That's an ideal weapons delivery system, especially if you can do it silently without any visible external engines. Hey, that's pretty special. And there are other aspects of that. Suppose you find a better way of detecting the presence of vehicles in the atmosphere besides radar. We know that you can make things stealthy. So maybe there's another technique that can be used if your enemies come up with a stealth approach. Remember, we spent $10 billion, Lockheed did, on developing a stealth aircraft. That's a lot of dough.
Especially
but it's valuable. Yeah, it's valuable if you can do that, if you can avoid the enemy's radars. I mean, So I'm saying that, just another UFO sighting, no big deal. But technology involved, very big deal. And there's no reason to distribute that around. You have one central group, and it's accountable only to the president. I mean, that was then. Who knows what happened to the group afterward? And once the name Majestic 12 was made public, that they're surely going to change the name.
So
that's
do you
standard
think
practice?
Right. Do you think nothing has really changed as far as UFO sightings and all that? So do you think there's most likely some type of organization as was still
yeah. Well, no
place?
question. Remember, MUFON gets 1,000 reports a month. Sometimes 800, sometimes 1,100. Okay, but so there's stuff still going on, and it may well be that they have changed what they do in response to what we do. If they find that we can detect them, they may want to. The aliens may want to stay out of our gun sights, so to speak. Now, I must admit, over the years, I have talked to 7 different people who quietly tell me about being in the military at a base where a pilot was sent up, scrambled to chase UFOs, and never came back. And that's kind of scary, and I have no reason to doubt them. But in addition, with Frank Ficino, who's written a book about the Flatwoods Monster case, he went through the New York Times files and found that, would you believe, there were 200 fatal military aircraft crashes in the early 50s. 200. And 5 of the pilots had been had flown over 100 missions in Korea, where there were MiGs trying to shoot them down,
Mm-hmm.
Those weren't fun trips. They come back to the United States, no MiGs, and 5 of them crashed. And New York Times, I mean, they had to be good pilots to avoid being taken down over there.
Mm-hmm.
And the New York Times used words like disintegrated and disappeared in some of these cases. So I think we know from several cases that have gotten a lot of publicity, English cases and stuff where pilots chased UFOs and their systems went off and came back on when the UFO left and stuff like that. So somebody was paying attention. And the case that I got most involved in, I guess, was a guy, an NSA listening post in Boca Chica, down Florida, or the closest base to Cuba. And I talked to a guy who had been stationed there. And one night, all they do is listen. You got to be a trilinguist. You got to speak Spanish, English, and Russian, because the Russians were running the show back in the 60s there. And one day, they hear the noise on the radio, so to speak, that a saucer was coming in from the northeast to the southwest, Mach 1, 30,000 feet. And the Russian Cuban Air Defense Command scrambles a couple of planes. They go up, they confront the UFOs, in effect tell them, get the heck out of our airspace. I don't know how you do that in Russian, but anyway. And it didn't faze the UFOs at all, so they radio the ground, what should we do? Shoot it down. Those decisions, I was told, normally were made by the Russians on the ground, not by the Cubans in the air. Okay, so the lead pilot radios that he's got a radar lock on, his missiles are armed, and then there's screaming over the airwaves from the second pilot that the first plane just disintegrated, exploded. And the UFO went straight up to 90,000 feet and went to the southeast at Mach several. And the guy said, we did what we normally do. We send a transcript of the conversation. And we get back instructions which were strange. They said, send the original tape. He said, that never happened. I said, do you think they wanted to be finding out what happened in that minute or so when between the lock-on and all the rest of that? He says, I don't know, but all I know is we sent the tape. But think about that case for a minute. They didn't take nasty action against the pilots until the pilots made an effort. You can tell when the other guy's got a lock-on you.
Mm-hmm.
And so you don't have much choice. You've got a few seconds to do something. You don't want them splattering you with a missile. So Zappo.
Wow.
And what can I say? If I have heard 7 guys, because I'm a big mouth and talk all over the place, surely there are more cases than that.
Yeah. Now, there was a time where, I had a past guest on that mentioned that there was a time where that was the stance, shoot them down, for the U.S. Air Force.
The orders were issued in 1952 to all military planes. If they don't land when instructed to do so, shoot them down.
Wow. And there are a lot of cases where they actually, according to what I've heard, I don't know if it's true or not, that they actually did fire with no results.
Well, I've heard that too. It's almost as if there was an invisible barrier.
Right.
I'd like to know how to do that.
Yeah. So that's it, everyone, for the free part of the show. Thank you for listening. If you'd like to listen to the whole 2-hour show, it gets really interesting, this one, an hour or two. And all you have to do is support us for just $2 or more per month. All that information's on podcastufo.com. So thanks again. I appreciate everyone listening. And next week we have Ryan Mullahy. He's going to be talking about something new that broke in the New Hampshire Pease Air Force Base as far as UFOs go. I'll be doing the show live from Russia and will for the next following several weeks. So thanks a lot, everyone, and we'll be back next week. Remember to keep your eyes to the sky.